Okay, welcome everyone to the fourth of our, sorry, it's distracting, the fourth in our series of talks and the final talk. So I'm glad y'all could make it here at the Synexic Grange and on Zoom. My name is Mara Roby, Natural Resource Specialist at Eastern Connecticut Conservation District. And behind me is my coworker, Jean Pillow. We want to let you know that this Farm Talk series has been funded in part by a National Association of Conservation Districts grant, as well as the Synexic Grange and the Woodstock Agricultural Commission. So thank you guys for being partners. For those of you who do not know who we are, Eastern Connecticut Conservation District, or ECCD. We're a nonprofit natural resource conservation organization, and we serve 36 towns in all of Eastern Connecticut, which is the red circle. And we do a lot of activities. Here's some of our primary activities. And we have to write a lot of grants to do these activities. So especially EPA, we do a lot of EPA grants. And that helps us promote these best management practices and then implement projects to reduce non-point source pollution often. And that is, you know, different types of pollution that can be coming from pet waste or animal waste or fertilizers, pesticides, all that kind of thing, not just a pipe going into the water. So those are called non-point sources, whereas a pipe going directly into water would be a point source. We also develop a lot of watershed-based plans. So the Little River Watershed-based plan is one of those. And we like to really engage residents and towns, such as yourselves, doing workshops like this. We've been doing a lot of Zoom workshops, but it's nice to do some of the in-person again, and we'll continue to do that for a lot of our projects. We also really like to assist towns, the land use commissions. We can help with environmental.
Oops, sorry.
Oops. And we can provide technical assistance to residents for things like pond reviews, things like that. If folks could mute, if you're unmuted, please mute, because we're getting some feedback here. Thank you. And then we also like to do a lot of demonstrations of new conservation methods. So the reason that we're here is the Little River Watershed-based plan update, which is something that Jean and I have been working on for a while and we'll be working on for another year. So in 2009, the Muddy Brook and Little River Water Quality Improvement Plan, that's a mouthful, was written. And at this time, there's a national water quality initiative that requires certain designations or guidelines to be, and so they changed the guidelines. So we want to get that, we call it NACWE, that acronym, easier to say than the whole thing. So we're trying to get that back for the Little River Watershed. So you see here the map. In green is the Little River Watershed. And, you know, just a definition of a watershed is basically wherever, you know, water falls on the land in precipitation or stormwater runoff, where that all flows to a certain point. All of those places where that goes is considered a watershed. And you can see here in red, there are some areas definitely that are not supporting or are some are fully supporting, but basically you have some areas that are not supporting of the state of Connecticut, you know, water quality goals. So you might be able to tell that this is a lot of Woodstock on this map. And then you also have a little bit of Thompson, a little bit of Putnam, and a little bit of Pomfret. And then you see that little piece going up into Massachusetts there. Don't worry if you're not in the Little River Watershed, that's fine too. We really want to help farmers in the Little River Watershed and in the Natchog River Watershed, which is a nearby watershed. And to do that, you know, getting that NACWE designation will be important. And we want to help in the sense of, you know, anyone who has animals or is a homesteader or has some type of a farm, whether you're making money or not. There are cost share programs from NRCS and the Farm Bill program that can assist you. And so normally you compete with the rest of the state, but when we have this designation, you would have we would have a pot of money that would be specific just to this watershed. So it would be a lot less, it'd be easier to get the funding. And then hopefully that would then in turn help to get funding in the Natchog River watershed and other watersheds as well. So Jean had mentioned this a little bit earlier to some of you, that we have a farmer survey, because part of this project is we really need to get a good sense of homesteaders, farmers, animal owners in the area. What kinds of things do you guys, you know, really need? What are the things that we can help with as far as NRCS helping? And that was something I should have mentioned also in some of the things that we do. I work with NRCS as a partner to evaluate their farms and also, you know, write conservation plans. So these are the things we want to know. What kind of future programming are folks interested in? And we could come out, Jean and myself, to your farm if you would like an evaluation, and just to really stress that both the survey and if we came out, it's all confidential. There would be no sharing of any personal information, especially in this report. It would be a public report, but we would have a summary of the information and we would never mention names. So that's something that we want to make sure people know. So we're really hoping that you'll take the survey so we can, you know, and even if you're not in the watershed, you know, it will be good for us to know that information. And I will send a link to that survey, or there is a QR code if you're so inclined to use your phone and read your QR code. You can take it right on your phone to make it easier. We're trying to make it easy. So we really appreciate that. And I'm happy to introduce now our speaker, Caro Roszell. She's a soil health specialist at American Farmland Trust. And Caro is based out of Massachusetts, so would have been quite a drive for her. So we're very lucky to have her on this Zoom talk. So we're happy to have you here, and it's a soil health for small farms talk. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and Caro can take over.
Awesome. Hi, everybody. I'm so glad to be here. Let me go ahead and share my screen. All right, so let's see. Can you all see that okay? Can I get a oh, I guess we don't have our videos on, but you can choose the little under participation, the little thumbs up app if you can see this okay.
Yes.
Yes.
Yay. Okay, great. Thanks. All right. So I'm super happy to be here. I'm Caro Roszell. I live in Wendell, Massachusetts, which is on unceded Nipmuc land. And I was an organic farmer for 9 years. And that whole time I also worked for the Northeast Organic Farming Association of Massachusetts. And now I work full-time for American Farmland Trust, helping farmers with their soil health through technical assistance programs, financial assistance programs, and education. And you know, it's been a while since I've done a talk of this length, so I might be a little rusty, but bear with me. And before we get started, I just wanted to get a sense of who's in the room, so to speak. So if you don't mind popping into the chat your name and your primary enterprise and how many acres you farm, that would be awesome. That'll help me get a sense of who's in the room. And hopefully I can see the chat. Let's see. It's a little hard to see it while presenting. So if anyone wants to drop that in the chat, your name, where you live, your primary enterprise, and the amount of farmland you farm. So I am farming just an acre, mostly for myself now. Okay, Amelia's Black Sun Farm in Killingly, just over 1 acre. Very cool. And are you growing vegetables, Amelia? Vegetables and herbs, awesome. Great. Anyone else want to share? And poultry, awesome, very diversified. Chris has a very large family garden in Woodstock. Paul, 120 acres, cool. Hi, Maureen, 1 acre, you homestead. Awesome, small garden. Jordan Stern has a small garden in Woodstock. Monique is an outdoor youth educator in Eastern Connecticut. And Charlotte has a large family garden in Putnam. This is awesome. Oh, Charlotte, I'm going to talk about Yoko and Alex of Asawaga Farm during this presentation. I hope you know them. All right, cool. I'm going to close the chat now and proceed. Thanks for letting me know who you are. That really helps me.
Actually, Caro,
yeah.
Can I interrupt?
Sure.
I'll maybe get a few folks from our
Yes,
audience.
please. That would be great. Thank you. Sorry, this is my first hybrid event, everybody, so I might be a little clumsy at it.
Yeah, us too.
Don't worry.
I can't hear you.
Could you hear that, Caro?
So you're gonna have to tell me.
Okay.
Convey
So
it.
Stuart Morse in Woodstock, he has 35 acres of abandoned gravel mining that he's trying to rehab.
Wow. Okay. Well, he should email me offline. I can connect him with somebody who's doing that work.
Email her offline and she can connect you with someone that's doing that kind of work. Does anybody else want to volunteer their information? Okay, so we have Sharon from Thompson, and I'm sorry, 4 acres, half is woodland and half is garden.
Awesome. Awesome. Anyone else?
Anyone else? Raise your hand. You don't have to, it's up to you.
No pressure.
We have Amy, who has 35 acres of forest land and about 7 acres of field.
Very cool. Yeah, I really miss in-person events where we could all kind of chat a little about who we are at the beginning. So thanks for that so much. So what I want to accomplish today is to review some soil health concepts, then discuss a few field indicators that you can use to evaluate your soil health without any special tools, and then share 2 case examples of some soil health champions who I've worked with in my career, and just sort of share some of the practices that they're doing as examples. So feel free during the talk to put questions in the chat, and I will stop periodically to see if there's any questions. And Maura is going to read those out for me. And if there's anything really urgent, like a clarification or something, just feel free to interrupt me for clarification. All right, so to begin, just to start with the very, very basics, as you probably know, soil scientists, farmers, and service providers often classify soil by its texture. So texture just means how much sand, silt, and clay the soil has, with sand being the biggest particle in the soil, silt being a size between sand and clay being the smallest kind of soil particle. And then soils are classified by their dominant soil particle, and the word loam refers to soils that have a mixture of sand, salt, and clay. So clay has a negative charge, and silt has a slight negative charge, and sand has basically no charge. And this is important because many important soil nutrients that plants need have a positive charge, and those are called cations. And the total number of cations that a soil can hold, or its total negative charge, is the soil's cation exchange capacity. And the higher the cation exchange capacity, the higher the overall nutrients that can be held in the soil. So as we said, clay has a lot of negative charge sites, and sand has very little. And it's pretty impossible to change the percentage of particles in your soil, but you can increase the amount of soil organic matter in your soil. And organic matter has about 10 times as much nutrient holding capacity as clay. So you can see here, this is just a little diagram. These two slides, by the way, are from my friend Laura Davis from NOFA Mass, who's the soil fertility advisor there. And she's a great resource if you ever need help understanding your soil labs. So she has this great slide that explains the way that, sorry, I just need to move my, oopsies, having a little bit of technical difficulties. All right, let's see if that's better. Sorry about that. So she has this great slide that just sort of shows the spectrum of soil characteristics, right? In terms of water runoff, leaching, fertility, organic matter, total exchange capacity, et cetera. You know, just on a personal note, when I started my farm, I had a market garden for 3 years in my town here. And I had a really low total exchange capacity, low cation exchange capacity because my soil is so sandy. So I added a lot of compost and I used straw and wood chips and planted a lot of cover crops. And I saw within just a few years, my lab results showed that my organic matter had gone up and my cation exchange capacity went up a lot too. So organic matter, let's talk about what it is. This is the part of our soil that we have more influence over, right, than our texture. So soil organic matter increases the water holding capacity of your soil. It increases your total nutrient holding capacity, as we just mentioned. It also improves your soil tilth and structure, reduces the compaction in the soil. It increases the amount of nitrogen that's available for your crop. It improves your crop resilience, which we'll get into a little bit more. And there's also more carbon cycling and carbon sequestration if there's enough photosynthesis and organic matter in your soil. Organic matter is really, it's basically the portion of your soil that is recently living or in process of becoming other living things, right? So when, say your source of organic matter is a fresh cut cover crop and you just mowed it down. It would be alive for a little while after mowing, both its roots and its leaves. And then as it starts to become dead matter, other living things go to work on it, right? Like the fungi and the bacteria and the other microbes that decompose cover crop residues. So in that process, the cover crop is converted from, it's a living thing, you mow it, it becomes a dead thing, and then it turns into other living organisms, right? So it's really a living process. So as the living becomes the dead, the nutrients and the energy from that organic matter is constantly being cycled into living things. And along that process, we are losing carbon from the soil in the form of carbon dioxide as portions of those organic matter are respired and decomposed, and then there's a respiration in the soil. So some of that carbon from the dead cover crop is being cycled back out into the atmosphere, but some of it is staying in the soil, being exchanged by microorganisms and other soil organisms. And then there's a very small part that is thought of as either the passive, so that's the active portion, right? The part that's being exchanged in the soil ecosystem. And then there's a part called the passive, which is a little bit controversial in the scientific community, also called the very dead, or also called stable organic matter. And I think it's important to emphasize that this portion of the soil, which is really the molecules and fragments of dead microbes that are associated and held on or adhered to the clay and silt particles in the soil, the parts of the organic matter residue that are trapped inside aggregates, and organic compounds that are hard for organisms to use because they've been decayed to a certain compound that's harder to decompose. These portions of the organic matter are not necessarily permanent. They're just longer lasting than other organic matter fractions. And so this portion of the organic matter is still vulnerable to certain disturbances, but it stays in the soil longer than these other portions of the organic matter, which have been recycled up into the atmosphere. So really what I'm trying to emphasize here is that soil organic matter is a living ecosystem of diverse living things, most of which are invisible. And I often hear the factoid that there are more microbes in a handful of soil than all the people on Earth. Soil organic matter as the living portion of the soil is about 50%, 58% carbon. carbon is the common element of all life. So when we think about soil organic matter being the living portion of the soil, it's the carbon-rich part of the soil and vice versa. And so soil carbon comes partly from decomposition, but that's not the whole story. Some of that actually comes from CO2. So just as some of your organic matter is being decomposed and respired as carbon dioxide, some carbon dioxide is also then coming back into the soil. And the way that that happens is through what's called the liquid carbon pathway sometimes, or photosynthesis. And in the process of photosynthesis, we have carbon dioxide, the plant takes carbon dioxide and water and the energy from the sun to make sugar, which I'm using a little donut to represent here, and oxygen, which it releases, as we know. So where does that sugar go next? Does anyone want to pop an answer into the chat? And I'll see if I can open it. Problem is I can't see my cursor at all. So if I want to look at the chat, I have to close it for a second. Does anyone want to tell me where? So some of the sugar that the plant makes is used for growing, and then some of it is used for something else. Does anyone want to pop a answer in the chat here? Or anyone in the room want to say what happens to the carbon that's not, or the sugar that's not used for growing the plant directly?
It feeds the fungi. It's one of the
Yay! Exactly. That's exactly right. So the plants push it out through their, oops, I have to do this whole thing. They push the cakes and cookies or the sugars out through their roots. Gosh, sorry. It's hard for me to close the chat. They push the sugars out through their roots into the soil, and some of the sugar goes to feed bacteria directly in the soil, but a lot of it, depending on your plant family, goes to feed the fungi first. Most of the crops that we grow, especially if we're livestock farmers and our main crop is grass, right? But in the vegetable family too, a lot of the crops that we're growing form these mycorrhizal associations with fungi. But an exception would be like the brassica family that doesn't really form these symbiotic relationships with fungi as much. And so they're more, they're feeding the bacteria in the soil more directly with their carbons. So the plants are pushing out these cakes and cookies, these sugars into the soil. And they are feeding the fungi, who are the brokers in the soil. And then the fungi are actually exchanging some of those sugars with bacteria in the soil that are not the same bacteria as maybe directly fed through the plant roots, but are actually special bacteria that the fungi have a special relationship with. So you often hear about, how ants farm aphids, right? They say they have a sort of a community of aphids that they're symbiotic with, that they like feed and take care of, and the aphids provide them with sugars. It's kind of like that. There's specific types of bacteria that the fungi work with directly, and so the fungi are taking the sugars from the plant roots, and then they're giving it to these specific bacteria that they associate with. And then the bacteria are actually breaking down the parent rock material in the soil and collecting minerals and providing those minerals to the fungi, which then goes back to the plant and trades those minerals for more sugar. And the fungi act as a broker in this exchange, and they facilitate sort of the efficient movement of these nutrients in the soil. And one of the really cool things that I learned about soil science is that fungi make, so you know about the hyphae, right? The mushroom is just the fruiting body, and then most of the fungi is actually exist as hyphae in the soil, or these strands. And one of the things that they do is they actually make little tubes in the soil that are coated in something called glomalin, which is a carbon-rich compound, which excludes water, and it actually protects the bacteria that move along those tubes from other bacteria eating them. So they sort of create these superhighways in the soil for the bacteria that they specifically are symbiotic with to move from one place to another in the soil, so that they can go mine for more nutrients for the plant. So it's a really, really cool relationship and a really cool sort of underground ecology that's all based on this sort of sugar economy that starts with photosynthesis in the plant. Here are just some pictures of some mycorrhizae up close. So mycorrhizal fungi are the fungi that form these relationships with the plant roots. We call that relationship between the plant root and the fungi mycorrhizal symbiosis. You can see here this pine sapling has a couple primary roots there, but most of what you see there that's white is the fungi. On the far right, you can see some pictures of what hyphae looks like in the soil. And on the far left, you can see like a real close-up of the white fungal hyphae wrapping around a root. So again, this is a really complex exchange system in the soil. And I think the reason I repeated the slide here is because I wanted to remind myself to tell you that, again, we have bacteria that work directly with the plant, but we have a broader array of biodiversity in the soil when we have fungi in the picture, because they're the ones that bring and support those bacteria that specifically work with them. So are there any questions on these concepts so far? I can't easily access the chat. So if are there any questions in the chat that I should know about, or? Yes, no?
There are no questions in the
Okay,
chat.
thank you. Thank you so much. Sorry. I just find that I have to keep like closing my presentation if I want to look at the chat. Okay, so one of the things that's important about this is that from the beginning, when we talked about sandy soils having a low cation exchange capacity, when we think about this whole living brokerage in the soil, where we have this whole living ecosystem where fungi and bacteria are working together to go scavenge nutrients for the plants in exchange for sugar. If we have a really sandy soil, but we support a lot of life in our soil, we can kind of overcome that low, sort of the chemical nutrient, the lack of a chemical nutrient holding capacity through that cation exchange capacity. And we can actually rely on living systems to hold nutrients and get them to your crop. So that's kind of an important feature of the soil ecosystem.
Caro, I'm just going to
yeah.
ask the group
Okay.
here if they have any questions.
Yes,
Does anyone
please.
have any questions? Nope. Okay, just want to make sure everybody's included.
Awesome. Yeah, and you know, again, just another point is just that this is a big difference, right, between conventional and organic agriculture or sustainable agriculture. In conventional agriculture, we tend to use plant available nutrients, right, fertilizers, which the plants can take up directly. They're soluble by their roots. Whereas organic agriculture tends to rely on amendments that have to be broken down by the life in the soil. So you're not directly feeding the plant, you're feeding the soil, and then the plant has to trade carbon in the form of sugar to the microbes in the soil in order to access those nutrients. So that's one of the big differences between conventional and organic agriculture. All right, so we got that part. Let's talk now about how some really simple ways that we can sort of assess life in our soil. Before I jump into some approaches, I just wanted to ask the group if there are ways, like what are the ways that you guys are already tracking your soil health? And feel free to, since it's hard for me to read the chat, folks who are on Zoom can just hop off mute and talk, and then folks in the room can talk through our interpreter here.
The amount of worms.
Yeah, earthworm count, that's a great one. Anyone else?
Color.
Color, awesome, great. We're gonna talk about that one, good.
I would also think pill bugs.
Oh, cool, yeah. It's interesting, pill bugs are so funny. I don't exactly know, they're detritivores, right? So if you have a lot of good residue, which is part of soil health principles, right? You'd have a lot of pill bugs.
Oh, what it's producing?
So crop
Yeah,
health,
what
yeah.
it grows.
Awesome. Anyone else before I move on? Okay.
Soil testing?
Soil testing. Oh yeah, lab tests. And so you're looking at your soil organic matter, and are you also looking at like your cation exchange capacity? Okay, anyone else? All right, so soil health assessment. I'm not going to talk about lab methods now. I heard one person's using labs, which is great. Organic matter is a good way. But there's also visible and physical indicators that you can use to get a sense of your soil health. These are best used to either track change over time or comparatively on your own farm between sort of management units, such as, you know, like a garden in your pasture or a fence row in your field, just to see what's going on. And these are just a few ways that you can get to know your soil a little bit better. Many soil health assessment methods can be accomplished with nothing more than a spade and some time. And, you know, you can bring a measuring tape with you if you want to get a little fancier. And then in terms of records, you can keep them with some simple worksheets and photographs. I find that digital photographs can be a really good way to track what's going on in your soil. So if every year you do some of these methods and you take a few pictures when you're doing it, and you label, like you change the name of the file to sort of say like what year it was, you can then maybe build a portfolio of photos that looks at change over time in your soils. There's a lot of different manuals out there that are available in a lot of different processes and frameworks so you can use. The two that I'm most familiar with are the NRCS Cropland Infield Soil Health Assessment Worksheet, which is what I mostly use now at American Farmland Trust. When I was at NOFA, I helped to sort of build this NOFA Mass Soil Carbon Grower Manual. I will pop links in the chat at the end of our session to these documents, but these are each just the first page of like 20-page documents that describe protocols and a number of different tests you can take on your soil to evaluate your own soil health. The NOFA, each of them has sort of like a basic worksheet associated with it. The NOFA Mass worksheets are a little bit more detailed. And the big difference between them is that the NOFA Mass methods are a little bit more detailed, using sort of one spot on your farm as a place to to track change over time, whereas the NRCS protocol is more a whole field snapshot. If you are a pasture person, the only resource I'm really familiar with, and I'm not an expert on it, is the NRCS's pasture score sheet, pasture condition score sheet. So I'm just starting to learn how to use this tool, but my background's in vegetables, so I'm not going to talk about that. It's also just important to note that soil health indicators vary a lot by soil texture. So remember when we talked at the top, soil texture influences a lot of factors about your soil. So, this is Simple Gifts Farm in Amherst, Mass, and I've done a lot of work with them. And it was interesting to me, I took some soil health samples on a few different fields in one of their soil types and a bunch in another soil type. And the soil, even though there were similar management practices, the soil health indicators are a lot higher, like a lot more positive soil health indicators in their more of their sandy loam soil. Whereas their loamy sand soil, which is much higher in sand, had lower soil health indicators, even though they were managing it very similarly, because sandier soils just have a harder time holding on to organic matter, and they're more vulnerable to disturbance and drought and things like that. So it's a good idea to get a sense of your property's soil map before you head out to do these indicators, and then try to compare indicators, if you're using them comparatively, within soil types if possible. So if you're not familiar with this tool, the URL's right here in the screenshot. It's just the web soil survey for NRCS, and you just load the tool. It's really simple. You put in your address and you can create an outline of your farm, and then you can produce this report with the soil map units or soil types on your property. So just kind of to give you a sense, it's a good idea to do that before you head out to do your assessment. I'm not going to talk about all of the assessment methods that we use. I'm going to stick to some really simple ones, stuff that you can see by going out and standing and looking at your soil, and stuff that you can look at by digging a hole and looking at your soil a little bit more closely. The first one is ponding and crusting. So ponding is really obvious. That's when you have standing water. Oh, it looks like my video is not working. Sorry about that. The video just shows me kind of like poking the soil in these little cracks you can see here. And when you poke your soil and they lift up and it's just like a flake of soil sitting on the top of your soil surface there, that's crusting. So that is something we don't want to see. If you have crusting happening on your soil, that's a sign that you have sort of degraded soil organic matter on your soil surface. And what's bad about that is that when your soil particles form a crust, it tends to restrict water from infiltrating into the soil, and it can lead to more overland erosion. And then ponding, if you have ponding, if water is just sitting on top of your soil when it rains or after you've irrigated and it's not infiltrating into the soil, that's also a sign that you have, compaction issues or low organic matter on the surface of your soil. Or you just have a really high water table and some compaction deeper and the water is not able to infiltrate at a deeper level. And you can investigate that with some of the tests I'm about to describe in a second. But that's ponding and crusting, so that's just the surface of the soil. Another thing you can do is really just kind of do a little assay of the biology, like right on the surface of your soil. What's happening? What percentage of the soil is actually covered? What percentage of it is covered in living plants? And what percentage of it is covered or occupied by living things that aren't plants? So fungi, for instance, fruiting bodies. I always take a quick assessment. In all the assessments, the two main assessments that I use, you always take a percentage of soil cover and percentage of living cover. So in this picture on the right here, we have the part of the soil that I was evaluating for percentage wise had a certain amount of mulch in it, and then also compost. I would call this 100% covered because you can tell that what's on the surface of the soil is a compost that's being used as mulch. You don't see any bare soil showing through, right? And then the percentage of living cover is just the amount of the soil that you're looking at that's got like a living soil canopy over it. Other things you might note are, like I said, fungi, if you see any fungi. Also, sign of other soil life. So on the far upper left there, I remember doing a soil health assessment in one place, and there was quite a few mouse nests on the surface of the soil. And so that was a sign, okay, that's soil life. It might be a rodent, it might not be desirable, but it's definitely a living thing. Generally, the NRCS considers you to be sort of like, meeting their criteria for a healthy soil if your soil is 75% covered. And that, again, that doesn't have to be living plant cover, that could be a mulch, but it's important to keep your soil covered. This also gives you some context for the other indicators that you collect. So just take a little assessment of how well your soil is covered. I'm not going to try to play this video, but the next thing I'm going to talk about is sort of digging a hole. Oh, and before I go on, just one thing. Also take a note of the total amount of different living things. So the biodiversity of your site. So obviously we don't see any living things in the compost mulch picture, but we see a lot of different plants in one, and then this, fungi or another type of organism. If you see slugs, if you see different types of insects, if you see signs of earthworms like middens, really any sign of life is important to note, and the total number of sort of different species that you can count is a helpful indicator. So then we dig a hole, and when you dig a hole, there's a lot you can tell from digging a hole as well. Someone earlier mentioned soil color. So one great way to sort of evaluate your soil color is to take an in-field sample and also a fence row sample. And if you don't have fences, it could be, the closest kind of unmanaged area that's just in perennial cover all the time, like your closest meadow or forest. That is within the same soil type. So that'll give you an idea of how's my field doing compared to an area I'm not managing. Is it darker or is it lighter? Carbon, again, being an indicator for being the same thing as soil health. We have more soil health, we have more carbon in the soil, and carbon is makes the soil blacker. So the darkness of your soil is a good indicator of its health. And you can compare that again across management practices on your farm, but also finding a fence row or non-managed area as comparison is helpful too. Where does the color change? Like how deep in your hole do you see a color change? On the far right, we have, a very obvious point at which the topsoil ends and the subsoil begins. And if you bring a measuring tape with you out in the field, or if you just want to eyeball it, you can kind of note for your records. You want to dig a bunch of holes because you don't want to just do one because soil is variable, but just get a general sense of how deep is my topsoil. At what point is there an abrupt color change? In the middle slide, we have something a little different where we have a compost layer that's been applied to the soil. And so there's a color change after the compost layer, and then there's a topsoil layer, and then the subsoil doesn't show up until below where we see on this shovel. So it's actually several inches lower even before we switch to a lighter colored subsoil. But one of the things that's kind of interesting about the slide is that you can kind of tell when a soil that's super biologically active will actually, the compost and the topsoil will start to blend together and become more integrated more quickly than a soil that's more has less organic matter or less soil health. You tend to see those sharp lines like that they persist for longer because the soil is not digesting that compost as quickly. So if you have a sharp line like that in your compost and you know it's been a while since you spread it, that can be an indicator that your soil health needs some work. And yeah, question? No, my mistake. So on the far left here, you see an example of a soil that's really nicely marbled. So you can see that this is a clod of soil that I pulled up out of the soil, and it was interesting to me to see the kind of patchiness of it or the marbled appearance of it, because that's a sign of earthworms are moving through the soil, the roots are pushing down and pushing carbon into it, and it's kind of mixing itself through biological processes. So another thing is soil structure. Soil structures are really, if you're going to look for one thing in your soil, I'd recommend looking at your soil structure and learning your soil structure. There are three main soil structures that we're really concerned with when we're doing soil health assessment, although there's more sort of subtypes and types of soil structure than just these three, but these are the big three. Granular, blocky, and platy. So on the far left, you see a granular soil structure. I hope that my slideshow, I'm just realizing I'm saying left and right, but I don't know if it's mirrored for you. But on my screen on the far left is a granular soil structure, that handful that it looks like cottage cheese is usually the way that we describe granular soil structure. In the middle, you see a soil that's a lot blockier. There's some granular at the very top of the slide, but lower we see soil that's blockier. So it's got more angular chunks. They're shaped, they have a lot sharper surfaces, right? And they tend to be bigger. And then on the far right of the screen, my screen anyway, is platy soil structure. So that's when your soil kind of breaks apart when you're digging into kind of plates in the soil or shelves. And that is, that's not good. So we want to see more granular soil structure and less platy soil structure. The NRCS sort of criteria for whether you have soil structure problems is if they want to see, for a good soil structure, they want to see that you have granular soil structure and no platy structure. If you have a problem with your soil structure, you don't have any granular structure, or if you have platy soil structure, or both. So granular is good, blocky sort of intermediary, and platy is a sign of a problem. Another thing you might encounter in your soil is unaggregated soil, which is like playground sand. It just doesn't have any structure at all. You might also encounter massive soil, which you see some of at the bottom of the blocky side. We have some sort of big chunks, and they're not they don't have a lot of surface area and they're just big and chunky, and that can be called massive soil. To extend the dairy metaphor as a helpful, I hope this is helpful, this is what I use, is that if granular soil structure is cottage cheese, then blocky structure is kind of like feta, right? When you buy feta in the grocery store. It's got a little bit more surface area. It breaks apart into kind of blocks. Massive soil is like cheddar. You buy a big block of cheddar. Platy structure is kind of like when you attend a party and the caterers cut up your cheddar into slices. Unaggregated soils like shredded Parmesan cheese, like the really fine textured stuff. I think that was all of my dairy metaphors. Yeah, so that's kind of a little trick that I use to kind of remember the soil structures, but this really tells you a lot. A soil that's healthier, again, is going to have much more granular structure, and it's going to be really, really low in the, you're not going to see blocky, you won't see much unaggregated soil, and really you shouldn't see any platy structure. Digging a hole, another thing you can do is look at root behavior. There's a lot of different things to look for in root behavior. We're looking for depth of the roots, like how well they're proceeding down into the soil, whether it seems like they're healthy and branched and they're not encountering any obstacles. This thistle root on the picture with the measuring tape, you can see where it's doing something called balling, where the root was proceeding down through the soil, and then at 4 inches, it hit some challenge, right? So I think that this was actually, we did see a compacted layer at 4 inches in the soil. So this thistle root is telling us about that compaction. It clearly hit a problem and it's kind of stopping, and it tried to go around and it balled up and eventually found a pathway through. But that balling up there is an indicator that there's a problem in your soil. We're also looking for beautiful rhizosheaths. So the middle slide doesn't have quite as good rhizosheaths as the slide on the far left, where we see those thick rat tails when the soil when the root is covered in soil and coated really nicely in soil. That's a really good sign. In the middle slide, there's some good rhizosheaths there, but we can also see more of the root showing through. And the other thing to look for is depth. So just like the thistle root on this farm where I was looking, this is that same farm that had that sharp line between the compost and the topsoil. So I saw a lot of roots kind of spreading out more than proceeding straight down, and that can be a sign that your plants are sort of favoring like a richer part of the soil. So in that case, the plant was kind of spreading its roots out into the compost layer and didn't want to proceed downward into that more compacted topsoil. And then biodiversity, just like in the surface of the soil, make a note of any biodiversity you see in your hole. So a lot, as we said in the beginning, most of the life in your soil is totally invisible, but you can see things like fungal hyphae. You can see the legume nodules. So when you have like a legume and you dig it up and it has like little pink nodules along that, those are actually bacterial colonies. So that's a soil organism that becomes visible through the nodules on the legume root. You can see earthworms. Someone mentioned earthworms earlier. Earthworm count is a great way to evaluate your soil health. I used to do earthworm counts pretty regularly, and I saw anywhere from 0 in a cubic foot of soil to 50. So it really does vary widely. The thing about earthworm count is it's a little bit seasonally variable. So spring and fall are the best time to do earthworm counts if you're going to make that part of your soil health assessment. And then of course, soil dwelling insects, often like larvae, like the insects themselves, ants, things like that, larvae and eggs. Does anybody want to shout out what this little beige thing is in this picture? Does anyone recognize what that is? Just come off mute if you know and just say.
Could it be a grub?
No. No. Good guess though. Anyone? This is an earthworm egg. I was so excited when someone taught me how to recognize those. So I just love this picture of this little earthworm egg tucked away in the soil. So yeah, so
Sorry, what size is that?
Oh, that's a good question. So they're like, I don't know if you can see me. They're like this big. They're like, what's an analogous? They're a little smaller than a pea. They're kind of like around the size of a lentil. I should have told you that, sorry. It's hard to tell from this picture. Yeah, so earthworm eggs are, even if you don't see earthworms at the time, if you see earthworm eggs, that's a good sign. So just making a note of any life you can see in the soil. So that's, those are just a few soil health indicators. There's a lot more that we didn't get into, but those are kind of the most accessible ones that you don't need any special equipment to do. Any questions about those?
We have a question.
Yeah.
So someone is curious about the Japanese jumping worms and
Sure.
if they're what they're a sign of.
They are a sign of globalization. Yeah, I mean, it's tough, right? So, all the earthworms in North America got wiped out, right, in one of the last ice ages. And then all the earthworms that we've become accustomed to came with ballast, right, from Europe. And now we have yet another new worm that's been introduced. And people are very concerned about it because it's so fast. It's big and it's really fast, and it spends more time at the soil surface than deeper in the soil. So we have different types of earthworms. Some earthworms hang out closer to the soil surface, and some, like the night crawlers, go way down in the soil. And one of the things that's nice about those deeper dwelling earthworms is that they bring residue down deeper into the soil. So they're actually really good for integrating your soil layers. But the jumping worm spends more time at the surface of the soil. And so there's a concern that it's degrading like duff layers and litter layers in the forest, and actually could potentially increase the speed at which carbon dioxide is released from soil surfaces because it's not protected by that residue. So it's a great question, but there's no putting that cat back in the bag now. It's just here, and like a lot of things, we just have to learn to live with it, I think, and it will probably cause some ecosystem change, which is unfortunate.
Are they competing or just coexisting with other worms?
I don't know the answer to that question. I would guess that they're coexisting in this because like they have their niche, but you'd have to ask somebody who knows more about them than I do. Okay, I think I have just.
There's a comment in the chat.
Yeah, oh good, thanks.
Charles wants to know, how do you increase living cover on soil surfaces?
We're gonna get to that in the next section. Can I get a time check? Because I was a little unsure about with the intro and everything. How much time do I have left?
Sorry, it's 7:25.
And what time are we going till?
Oh, it's 7:25. If people are willing to, I thought it'd be 45 minutes to an hour, but whatever works.
Okay.
Are people willing to stay a little longer? They are here.
Great. So can I talk for another 10 minutes?
Sure.
Okay. So I'm gonna proceed to a few things about soil health practices to address the question about residue. All right. So the 4 rules of soil health are minimize disturbance, right? Because we're trying not to disturb those aggregates, and we want to protect the living ecosystem in the soil. 2, maximize soil cover. Again, that also protects the living things in the soil, improves the habitat for living things. And maximize our days in living cover, because that keeps photosynthesis happening on the soil. So it's pushing more carbohydrates into the soil to feed all the soil life that depends on that sugar economy. And increase biodiversity, because when we have more different types of roots and more different types of plants, and we actually increase the above ground biodiversity, increases the below ground biodiversity, because we have this symbiotic relationship. So we need above ground diversity for below ground diversity. So I'm going to talk about 2 farmers that I've worked with who have great soil health management systems and are doing some really cool practices. So I'll just give a quick overview of some of their practices and how they're building soil health. Asawaga Farm, one of my favorite farms in New England, Yoko and Alex, they have a sandy loam and a loamy sand that they're working with. They grow diversified vegetables with a focus on Japanese vegetables and Japanese varieties. At the time that I was working with them, they had just under an acre cultivated, but I think they've since expanded to 2 acres. They do farmers markets in Brooklyn and Somerville, and they have a CSA. and restaurant sales. So they're a hand scale market garden. And in 2019, I did a soil health assessment for them, and most of the indicators were strong, but they had a lot of bare soil on their farm, and the aggregation wasn't as good as I would have expected for a hand scale soil health focused farm. So our recommendation to them at the time was to increase their soil cover and do more cover cropping. And so they did. And so some of the ways that they did that was that they started working with a rye cover crop, which they would crimp then with, and this is a hand scale farm, so sometimes cover cropping can be challenging. But what they would do is they would crimp it down with a board crimper, or just drag a tarp right over it and terminate it with a tarp. I think they are now doing more mowing of their cover crop, but when they first started out, they were doing it this way. And that created a nice, so the rye would die under the tarp, and it would create a nice a nice thick mulch layer that they could plant their transplants through, which would keep nice soil cover, and also all the roots from that cover crop that they weren't ripping up with plowing helped to give more soil structure and to sort of provide organic matter and habitat for soil organisms. They also started to do more active residue management. So they would use a Gorilla walk-behind tractor, and they got a flail mower for it. And they would actually terminate a lot of their cover crops by flail mowing that, and then leave the residue on the surface of the soil to increase that surface residue. And they also they got a Caravaggi chipper shredder for their walk-behind tractor, and they use that to spread mulch. So they were able to make more mulch on their farm, and that was able. Mulch can get really expensive, so that was a good way for them to increase their mulching. And in terms of, let's see, so the combination of tarps, mulch, and cover crops was really helping them to increase their soil cover on their farm. And then for the biodiversity part of the rules of soil health, they actually were doing they began doing a lot of intercropping. And I think that they did a lot of experimentation last year, and now they're starting to kind of scale that back a little bit. And they do give soil health talks at NOFA Connecticut and other and conferences and things. So if you can go to one of their talks, I highly recommend it. Yoko shares a lot of great information about what worked with intercropping and what didn't, but they do multiple crops in one bed. So for example, relay cropping here, where they have a quick growing kohlrabi crop next to a longer season artichoke crop. So they are able to harvest out those kohlrabi while the artichoke is sizing up. And then by the time the artichoke is getting really big, they've harvested out all that kohlrabi. So that's just a way of increasing plant diversity in their beds. And then also cover cropping with, or intercropping with cash crops is what that slide. Confusing myself. So this is a way of cover cropping with cash crops, in the sense that if you want to keep more of your soil covered in living plants, you can actually use cash crops, but then remove them as they size up. And then I think that they were also doing some work with intercropping with cover crops as well, but we'd have to ask Yoko about that. But those are just a few practices that they're doing to really increase their living and their residue cover on their fields. Freedom Food Farm in Raynham, Mass is another great farm. They're doing a lot of cool experimentation. That's Chuck Curry there is the main farmer, and they have a loamy sand. It's really sandy soil. They've really struggled with soil health because it's such a sandy soil. While they have a total of 90 acres, they are just doing 4.5 acres in vegetable, and they were a mechanized farm. What's interesting about them is that they did something that I'm seeing a lot of farmers that are at a mechanized tractor scale doing, who are interested in soil health, which is that they're actually splitting their farm into a market garden and field crops. So they're taking all of their high rotation crops and they are concentrating them into like a 1 acre parcel, roughly, and managing them the way that Yoko and Alex manage, like hand scale, using more hand tools and compost and mulches and higher inputs, whereas the field crops are still managed with tractors. And the way that they're doing, so here's their market garden. And the way that they're doing their field crops, in 2019, they were using a flail mower and then a chisel plow instead of a moldboard plow, and then a finishing or light disc and a perfecta. And they're also using animals to graze their cover crops down in some cases to reduce tractor passes. But in 2020, they actually removed some of those harrow passes by incorporating a seed drill into their operations. So they were able to seed and not need to use a harrow to integrate their seeds, as well as not needing to integrate as much of the residue because the seed drill is capable of drilling right through residues. So it eliminated some of their bed prep. And they also acquired a roller crimper at the end of last year that I don't think they've used a lot yet, but they're going to be able to replace some of the mowing with roller crimping. And let's see if I can get this video to work as my last slide here. I just wanted to share their transferred mulch system, which is their newest practice that they've just started doing, where essentially they're growing a cover crop and then they are harvesting that cover crop as a mulch to use elsewhere on the farm. Let's see if I can fast forward a little bit. So this system involves harvesting. Can you all see this video okay? Let me know if it's not playing. Skip to, sorry.
I think you just need to unmute it too.
Oh, I'm not going to play the audio. I'm just going to kind of explain.
Okay.
See. Here we go. I'm just having a hard time finding the spot. So here's he's got a forage wagon and a forage chopper, and he's mowing his cover crop. It's hard to get the exact spot in the video, sorry. This is on the NOFA Mass YouTube channel. So he's using a forage chopper and he's harvesting the cover crop and blowing it into this like a forage wagon. And then the forage wagon, I don't think this is going to show it in the video, but the forage wagon then dumps into this manure spreader. And he's modified the manure spreader a little bit, and he's still dialing it in a little bit, but it's supposed to dump the fresh green chopped cover crop right onto his beds. And then what he's going to do is he's going to actually use a no-till transplanter to, which is it's a water wheel transplanter with an attachment on it to cut through this residue here and plant transplants right into that mulch. In this example here, what we're looking at is actually additional mulch being added on top of beds with a cover crop that's going to be used for garlic. But he can, in the springtime, what he can do is he can put all this mulch on his beds, and then he can actually use the no-till attachment on his tractor to, between his tractor and his water wheel, to actually cut through that residue and plant right into it. So those are just some kind of interesting cutting edge soil health management systems and practices that people are trying. So that's all my prepared slides. And now I'll stop sharing and we can kind of have a chat, and I'll put those links in the chat for you. Any questions? Oh, Chris says he loves the cheesy analogies. Thanks.
Okay, we have one here too.
Great.
How do you mulch a perennial mature garden without disturbing the flowers?
Oh, cool. Yeah. Well, I guess what kind of mulch do you want to use?
Commercial compost?
Commercial compost? Okay. Yeah. So I guess it depends on when you're mulching. I do most of my mulching in my perennial beds in the fall because I can see where stuff is. And then in the springtime, I go and I just, if I think anything's sort of being smothered, I can just rake it off. But if you're applying compost, compost is gonna, depending on how biologically active your soil is, it might decompose quickly. So I usually recommend for perennials, it's nice to have like a wood chip or a straw, because that's gonna last longer on your soil and keep the residue and keep the soil protected longer. Whereas compost is gonna kind of turn into it's gonna get digested by the soil pretty quickly. So it doesn't last very long. So I just use a wheelbarrow and a shovel and just put it around my plants. And the heavier mulches I use in the fall so I can see where the plants are. That would be my advice. I hope that answered the question.
Thanks. Anyone else?
The
Rebecca?
video that you had of the mulch spreader or the where can I find that?
Okay, that's on the note. Let me pop in the chat. That's on the NOFA Mass YouTube channel. When I worked for NOFA, we were doing a lot of education and recording as much of it as we could for these practices. See if I can pop that. I'll look for that link and pop it in the chat.
Thanks. We're hoping to do something with probably wood mulch, which is what we have a lot of access to. And we were thinking an old manure spreader could somehow get it onto our pastures to develop the soil better.
Oh, it's a great idea. I love that idea. All right, here's the there's a link to that video in full. It's a long video and there's a lot of discussion. They show some different equipment, which is really cool.
Oh, cool. Thank you.
Okay, we have a question, Rebecca. Let me see if I can remember that. She planted a cover crop of radishes. And what was the rest of that? Great. She's wondering if the radishes will push it more towards bacterial soil because that's what they like. Did I get that right?
I think it's really depends on what else is going on in your soil. I don't think that radishes alone would have a huge influence on that. If you have, let's see, let me think about this for a second. I think as long as you have other species of plants that you're growing in the same area, either after that or at the same time, which is better, then you shouldn't move that needle too much. And these things are dynamic, they change, right? So, but I generally encourage people to always grow a cover crop mix. And if it's really a challenge for you just to get a cover crop in and all you can do is plant one species, go for it, because no cover crops are better, or cover crops are better than no cover crops. But as much as you can move toward planting multi-species cover crops, better that is for your soil, because you'll really increase your carbon and your nitrogen in the soil that way, your ability to hold on to different nutrients, and your soil biodiversity. So planting cover crop of radishes is great, especially if you have compaction that you're trying to work with, but if you can mix it with a grass, that's always a great idea as well.
Okay, I'm going to read some questions from the chat.
Awesome.
From Charles Kaiser. How do you increase living cover on soil surfaces?
Cover crops, and like what Yoko and Alex are doing at Osawaga, where you practice cool creative intercropping. So when I was running a CSA on my farm, I did a lot of intercropping, so growing cash crops as sort of in the function of cover crops. So for instance, when I would plant tomatoes, I always planted either leaf lettuce or head lettuce, or what else did I do? Radishes, turnips, beets, something like that next to the tomato. So if the tomato's in the middle of your bed, a band of another type of crop that's going to come out before the tomato sizes up, and that has a shorter days to harvest, right? If you do that, you can have more photosynthesis happening, more living cover, but you're not, it's something that you're going to be using for profit. Another thing you can do is plant like if you plant your row of tomatoes and you have a cover crop growing next to the tomatoes, and then you're going to use landscape fabric later, you can put the landscape fabric right on top of that cover crop as the tomatoes are starting to size up. And then you're going to kill the cover crop through blocking the light, just like a tarp. But you can have that living cover for a longer period of time. You can just have a strip down the middle of the cover crop where you've planted your tomatoes. So I've experimented a fair amount with that as well. And then just squeezing in cover crops whenever you can. So a lot of farmers, if they finish a spring crop and they don't have a fall crop going until a little later and they have enough time, they'll just throw a buckwheat cover crop down. And that's squeezing in something living that's going to photosynthesize, it's going to push carbon into the soil, support your soil microbiome until the next crop is ready to go in. So looking for any way that you can put something living where you might have bare soil, or where you might have a period of time where the soil is sort of empty of life. It's just a great strategy for supporting soil life.
Okay, we have a question from Jordan. I thought that wood chips were not good.
I love wood chips. I use tons of wood chips in my garden, and I used tons of wood chips when I had a market garden, a CSA. The thing about wood chips that people struggle with is that they can tie up the nitrogen in your soil. So I always recommend that if you're using wood chips, you put a little bit of supplemental nitrogen. You know, it depends on how you're using them. So I use them in my pathway, in which case I'll put a little supplemental nitrogen right at the bed edge so that any crops that I'm growing right up to the bed edge don't turn yellow and get stunted. If you're going to use wood chips on the surface of your bed, it's a good idea to put a little bit of supplemental nitrogen, like feather meal or blood meal, if it's the springtime, feather meal, if it's more a longer season crop, right on the surface of the soil, and then put the wood chips on top of it to prevent that nitrogen, or it doesn't prevent the nitrogen tie up, but it just makes sure there's enough nitrogen available for your crop. Another thing I've experimented with that I had good luck with was soaking this was an experiment, so it's kind of on a small scale, but I had 8 5-gallon buckets, and I put wood chips in those 5-gallon buckets, and then I put fish emulsion and water, and I let it sit for a week before I spread them. So the wood chips soaked up all the fish emulsion. And then I used those without any additional nitrogen on the soil surface. And that grew the best crop of broccoli I've ever had, because it was sort of charging those wood chips with some nitrogen. So it didn't end up robbing the soil.
Okay, we have a question from Amelia. When you do everything with hand tools, do you need to dig into the soil to add the compost or manure? I have been doing no-till.
Yeah, so it kind of depends on what you're going for and what your particular soil circumstances. But generally in no-till farming and gardening, the practice is to just put everything on the surface of the soil and trust that the biology is going to mix everything up. That said, this is an active area of soil science research, and there's a lot of concern in sort of the climate mitigation and soil carbon space about is no-till farming tending to accumulate lots of carbon and soil organic matter at the surface of the soil, and actually reducing on average how much is deeper in the soil. So the positive intention is that we are trying to not disturb the soil aggregates, and we're trying to not break up the fungal hyphae, so we can support lots of fungi in our soil, because tillage tends to rip them apart. And we're trying to have a good habitat in the soil. But the downside is, are we actually causing like a really lopsided distribution and accumulation of soil organic matter on the surface of the soil? And the problem with that might be that might have higher nitrous oxide emissions. And nitrous oxide is 300 times more potent as a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. So the caveat to all of this is to say that it might be beneficial. We don't really know. And the climate scientists and the soil scientists are talking about it. It might be the case that actually every once in a while, turning over your soil is a good idea in terms of getting that deeper soil health, like soil organic matter deeper in the soil. But what we don't want to do is do it all the time, because if we're doing it all the time, we're just kind of hitting that soil biology over and over again, right? Soil ecosystems are pretty resilient. They can handle some disturbance, but what we don't want to do is disturb them over and over and over again so that we're damaging and pulverizing those aggregates and damaging those fungal communities. So there's not really a good answer for how often you should be digging. There's not really a good answer of, should you dig it in? I would say generally leaving it on the soil surface most of the time and then occasionally digging it in. But we just don't know. We don't know anything more specific than that. So that's not a very specific answer, but.
No, that's very interesting. I didn't actually know that myself. So Charles would like to know, no, we already did that one, I believe. Oh, one new message, sorry. Paul Ray. Oh,
Sorry, I'll say one more thing about the digging in. There's some cool, there's this farmer, Mike Rossweiler in New Jersey at North Slope Farm, and he's doing this interesting thing he calls the favorable furrows. This is his soil health management system for his field crops. So he's got the split farm too. He's got a market garden and then he has field crops. And so say for his tomatoes, what he does is he goes out into his field and he uses a ripper on his tractor toolbar to just rip a trench in the soil. And then he goes along with his, I think it's a drop spreader or maybe a big bucket on the back of his, I forget exactly, it might be a bucket on the front of his tractor, but he basically goes along and he just dumps compost right into that furrow. And then he plants in that furrow. So that's his way of sort of, instead of just putting compost on the whole surface of the bed where he's going to put his tomatoes, he just rips a strip through, and this is into a cover crop, by the way. Sorry, I should have said that. So he's kind of doing this thing where he's got the soil, the cover crop living, he's terminating like a little bit of it, he's ripping a furrow through the soil, and then he's putting compost into that. So he's sort of getting compost deeper in, and he's going vertical, or yeah, vertical instead of horizontal with his compost. So that's kind of an interesting approach. And he's getting some really good results with that. Sorry, I thought I should share that.
No, that's great. And then Paul said that they raise meat chickens, and could you tell them more about feather meal? And is this something he can make?
I don't know too much about how feather meal is made. I assume that it is, the generalized poultry byproduct that might be like a combination of like the litter from the bottom of confinement operations, as well as probably like what's left over from chickens after they're processed. I assume that that's what feather meal is. I mentioned it earlier because it's considered a really good source of slow release nitrogen. So if you're looking to put some nitrogen down on your soil that is going to slowly release throughout the season, as opposed to blood meal, which is a lot more of that is more quickly available. It's just an example of a slow release fertilizer. I think that you can probably make it, Paul, if you process your own chickens. But I think you'd have to, I think, should they be chopped? I don't know. You could probably find this information by kind of searching how feather meal is made online. But I imagine it would be helpful to put it through a chopper. The feather meal that I've purchased is it looks a lot like a granular fertilizer. So I think it's really finely chopped, and it's probably also dehydrated to make it food safe. But that's all I know.
All right. Does anyone else have any questions from either the Zoom or in the room? Hearing none.
Charles wants to ask a question verbally.
Oh, yeah. Yep.
Yes.
ahead, Charles.
Can you hear me?
Mhm.
Okay. We lease our highlands for hay, but I noticed that the hay grass covers only half, the soil surface, and there's been a lot of erosion this year.
Mm-hmm.
So what can we suggest to our farmer to improve, the problems with erosion.
So you're saying, when you said the hay covers only about half the soil surface,
The
is
hay,
that
the hay grass.
the hay grass? So you're saying that like when you look at the field, you would give it about a 50% living cover score.
Right.
Okay. And the other 50%, you're saying you would say is bare soil, or is there like a residue?
No, it's really bare soil.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I wish I was on the other side of this project I'm on right now, where I'm actually doing a massive soil health evaluation that involves a lot of hay fields. What I know from my training from NRCS and from talking to other farmers is that hay fields tend to have lower soil health than grazed fields. If you have like a fence running down the middle of like a grazed and a hay field, because when you have grazing happening, right, you're cycling more nutrients, and you've got the biodiversity of the ungulate's gut involved, and the pee and the poop, and whereas with hay, you're removing biomass every single time you hay. So whether it's like 1 or 4 times a year, you're just pulling biomass off the field. So you're not cycling the organic matter, right?
Right, and they cut it down to as far as you can cut.
Yeah. So I'm not a grass person. My background's in vegetables, but what I will say is that it seems to me that from the hay fields that I've looked at and evaluated, the hay fields that have the higher soil health and the least erosion are hay fields that where it seems like the hay is being cut like higher, and there's also an ideal mix of clovers and grasses, where the clover, when the hay is cut, the clover kind of is able to spread out and keep the soil more covered. So I don't know if he's got, maybe he needs an adjustment of some of the species in the mix to make sure that there's when it's being cut, it's able to regenerate properly, and also maybe it needs to be cut a little higher.
Yeah, well, I would agree with you there. He has a bit of clover here, but he is cut so low that some portions go bare during a drought, or
they go
when
bare during a drought.
Yeah, when it's really stressed. So
yeah. Without being able to actually evaluate the soil myself, I would have a hard time advising, and it's also not my area of expertise, but I think that, do you have a relationship with NRCS?
not yet.
I would really start there. I mean, that's they have some great folks who really know grasslands at NRCS, and they can probably provide some resources, and even some potentially, if you qualify, some cost shares for adjusting your practices.
Right. I mean, when I bush hog or mow the alleyways around these hay fields, I get a lot thicker cover. It's probably a Kentucky bluegrass or something. It's not his hay type grasses, but I get a much better coverage of the soil that way.
Yeah. One thing I can share is that there's this really great project called the Marin Carbon Project, which is a long-term study on rangeland soils. And what they found is that when they had a degraded grassland, and this is California, but it's Northern California still, when they had a degraded rangeland, they experimented where they did experimental plots where they added 1 inch of compost just to the rangeland. And they found that they got 3 years of successive carbon increases in the soil, or organic matter increases in the soil, beyond the beyond the carbon that's included in the compost that they added, right? So that's on top of the carbon that was added in the compost. So what that suggests is that addition of organic matter and the biology that's in the compost really boosted that rangeland, the grassland, so that it was photosynthesizing better, and any of the kind of soil structural and soil biodiversity gains really helped that crop to just rebound more quickly, to photosynthesize better, and they got all these additional, all this more carbon into the system, more soil health. So adding organic matter to a grassland can really boost it and help it to recover more quickly from cutting.
Okay, well, thank you.
And I would just add, Charles, that if we can be of assistance, or I can be of assistance to help you make those connections with NRCS, I'm really happy to do that. So.
Yeah, sorry, I should have said, talk to your local conservation district. I'm sorry.
No, that's, we'll bring them in on that. It sounds like a more complicated problem than I could probably figure out. So yeah, this has been great. I don't know if you saw all of the yep, all of the links have been posted in chat. Somebody asked. And I really appreciate, Caro, you're amazing, wealth of knowledge. And I think a lot of other people here feel that way, because that's why we're all staying longer. So really appreciate your time, and I might have to pick your brain sometime if you don't mind.
Oh, anytime. This is
so
my
if there
favorite topic, so I always love being
Yeah,
so
I think I can tell. All right, well, thank you very much.
Have a wonderful night, everybody. I hope that we can all meet in person someday.
All right, thank you.